Today on the British Chamber of Commerce Presents Afternoon Tea With, we have Mark Lloyd Davies, Senior Executive at Johnson & Johnson.
And just so everyone knows, I mean, going to Antarctica was not like an orientation on boarding course at J&J. It was actually to do with my PhD on climate change. It's important to me, but also important to J&J, because not only is it the right thing to do, but it really helps enhance performance of teams and organizations. As the cons list is not ever as real as you think it will be. It's actually much shorter and almost non-existent. And the pros list is much longer than what you think.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Presents Afternoon Tea With. This is a series where we look to explore the professional and sometimes personal experiences of some of the key and very notable figures working in and around Brussels. Today, we have the absolute privilege to have with us Dr. Mark Lloyd Davies, who's a senior executive at Johnson & Johnson. Mark, thank you very much for joining us for an afternoon tea.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Mark, if you don't mind, let's start by briefly introducing yourself and what you do here in Brussels.
So I have the role in working in the medical devices business of Johnson & Johnson. And so a lot of that work is working with the Brussels-based institutions in advocacy on medical device regulation, patient safety, and health policy as well. But one area I'm very keen on and like to drive is the whole topic of diversity and inclusion. So at the British Chambers of Commerce, I've been really supporting the team and committee there, and they're doing an amazing job. I mean, they're starting out and really sort of beginning to make some strong inroads, and that's very important. And it's important to me, but also important to J&J, because not only is it the right thing to do, but it really helps enhance performance of teams and organizations.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's something that the Chamber's really embracing at the moment, and we're really trying to push forward, and actually sort of doing an in-house thing as well, making sure that we have a proper structure internally. So Mark, normally I would ask people what they thought, their expectations of what Brussels would be. Before coming. So clearly you're British and you went to the University of London. And I understand then you had that initial step of going abroad by studying at the University of Amsterdam. Yeah. So what were your expectations from what Brussels would be before you got here?
Yes, yeah, great question. And it's particularly personal, I'll never forget it. Because I moved here in August 2016, just a few weeks after the referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. And it seemed that I was going against the tide, where everything was going in the other direction, and I was heading out, striking out towards Belgium, towards Brussels. And I must say, I kind of have had sort of three emotions and thoughts really at the time of moving out. One was a very positive one. I really enjoyed my time abroad doing my PhD at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I'd heard good things from friends of mine who worked in companies, organizations about the, if you like, quality of life, the fact that commutes weren't sort of super long compared to Southeast England, and just the international environment there. But there was also, indeed, and I kind of admit this really, that there's a concern about, Brussels was this highly bureaucratic and dogmatic city of just bureaucrats and tall, glassy buildings. And that is an impression that I was given very much through public discourse and media in the UK. So that was in my mind's eye too. And then the third one, of course, was unlike when I went to the University of Amsterdam, I was single, I was a bachelor on my own. But this time I was moving with a wife and two children. And the thought was, well, how will they find it? It's not just me going, but how will they integrate and what impact will it make for them? So that was really top of my mind.
Yeah, so your expectations were really of a fairly potentially hostile environment. I mean, if you consider what the British press was saying. So, and I'm sorry, Mark, but I've got to put you a little bit on the spot, because I don't think I'm ever going to talk to somebody else that will be able to make this comparison. So I'm going to ask you about your actual experience living here, professionally and personally. But if you don't mind, I'd like you to make a comparison, because I understand that you have lived in some fairly hostile environments. That is, you lived out in Antarctica for a little while. Is that right? So So can I ask you, could you please compare Brussels, living in the potentially hostile environment that is Brussels, and living in what it would, I'm sure, be a hostile environment that is Antarctica?
Yeah, no, great question. And just so everyone knows, I mean, going to Antarctica was not like an orientation on boarding course at J&J. It was actually to do with my PhD on climate change at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Well, Belgium and Brussels is cold and wet in winter, but not as cold as Antarctica. That's one thing. And I tell you, the most remarkable thing about Antarctica, I was there twice, once for nearly 3 months, and then the other time for just over 2 months, is what most people don't realize. They know it's very cold, but there's two other factors. It's extremely windy and it's extremely dry. And so dehydration and wind chill are often your biggest human discomforts you have to really be aware of. And then if I look back on the tougher days of being there, 'cause we're out in Scott polar tents, you know, out in the mountains, collecting rock samples and so forth. It was the dehydration and the wind that really got to you. You know, you'd spend maybe a couple of hours doing drawing, which you had to do in part because you had sometimes to take your gloves off. So you only get your gloves off for about 5 minutes before it came to unbearable. And you maybe spent 2 or 3 hours drawing because you didn't have digital cameras in those days and it was all done by hand. And you put your piece of paper down and it would be off and you've lost it. And for the first few days, kind of adjusting to all of that was a big point. But it is amazing. It's beautiful. It's incredible. It's you get used to a new form of silence, if you like, especially when the wind stops. And it is the most extraordinary place I've been to on Earth. I mean, it really is amazing. But its beauty and its vastness is what really stays with me. You do lose a bit of a sense of smell because there's not a great deal to smell up there. It's not like you lose it forever. But I do remember getting off the plane in Auckland. We flew via New Zealand with the Royal New Zealand Air Force. And the first thing I smelt was cut grass from 150 meters away. Wow. And you know, you get that cut grass smell, and you can smell that. But this one was like cut through the distance and the air fumes, because I just hadn't smelt that for 3 months. But it's an incredible place. And actually, talking about the EU, the Antarctic Treaty, which comes up in 2045, so actually not that far off, only 25 years, will be critical. I think the EU should play a role there because at the moment, commercial excavation, for example, and exploration is prohibited in Antarctica, and also mass tourism is prohibited. You have a little bit around the waters, but not at scale. There's no hotel, for example, on the continent. And only people go there are scientists. And I think there's a very important, there'll be a lot of important discussion come that treaty in 2045 about the future of, if you like, the last pristine continent on Earth. Yeah. But yes, it's very different to Belgium.
I mean, but speaking about pristine places and immense beauty, so I think it's fairly comparable then, isn't it, to Brussels?
Yeah. Well, I think the research area just me and 2 other guys had was like the size of Belgium. Right. Compared to Brussels, well, I would say, to be positive, there's some parts of Brussels which are stunning, like I think the Grand Place. I generally think the Grand Place is definitely the most underrated public square in Europe, if not the most beautiful public square in Europe. But as we know, there are parts of Brussels which are not pristine, and how should we say, well used by humanity is probably the best take I can put on it.
Very, very generous of you. But no, I've got to agree with you. When I go with my kids very frequently into the Grote Markt, the Grand Place, it's I've got to say, it's one of those places that I never get tired of walking into that place. It's absolutely just stunningly beautiful.
Yeah, it is.
But so living in Brussels and with a family, how has that been in terms of what your expectations were like, and actually living here and working here? Have you found that it lived up to what you read in the British press, or?
Yeah, it exceeded expectations. It exceeded it, and actually, do you know what's interesting? Every expat or Brit I spoke to before they moved to Brussels said exactly the same thing. And why did it exceed expectations? I think I think there's something, I mean, when I say sort of quality of life, it's not like, you know, maybe that media perception of sort of lobster bibs and foie gras every day for lunch. It's not that. But if you say, for example, come from Southeast England, where I'd come from, where it's not uncommon for people to spend an hour, but pre-COVID-19 days, and an hour and a half on a commute into London, working a 9-hour day and then an hour and a half back again, and it costing them thousands of pounds in rail fares per year. And then compare that to basically either a short bicycle ride, a short drive of 20 minutes, or another form of public transport. I mean, that is a real shift and gear change compared to what most people are used to. There's also something about, I mean, there are, you know, there's something about the public parks, the cafe culture, the squares. There's slightly kind of, you know, it's okay to take a break for half an hour and have a coffee or a beer or something like that, which kind of by osmosis permeates into you. And I think that is missing a bit in parts of more Anglo-Saxon culture, where, you know, there are positives to this, of course, but, you know, working and delivering, that's first and foremost. And if you are going to take a break, you know, you socialize hard as opposed to just socialize gently. Right. So I think those were differences. But then one thing I will say for sure, these are positives, and there are challenges too, I can mention. But I think it's a great place to raise children because it's just less busy and intense of some of the bigger British cities. Fewer cars, there are cars around, but actually fewer cars, believe it or not. So my children, for example, learned to ride their bicycles, and there are loads of parks and open spaces where they could do this safely. And so that was another piece. When you add up these relatively small things, when you accumulate them together, it does become a positive. There's one other thing I'll mention which is interesting, and I'm not making a political point here, but, you know, shops mostly shut on Sunday, so people just relax on Sunday. So, you know, it's that sort of image I want to give, but it's also a hardworking professional city as well. And people working very hard. Some of the brightest people I know brought to Brussels with their company or their institution or their government. And there are challenges too, largely to do with bureaucracy and largely to do with, how shall I say, customer service on service-based industries. You really notice that difference compared to the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I tried to go and buy a car recently and left all of my details. They never contacted me back. It's rather a bizarre experience. You know, it's a big purchase. You would have expected them to be on the phone all the time. But
oh, exactly. Yeah, no, that's there are many stories. Anything ranging stories such as adverts saying buy this for €5 or buy 2 for 10. And you think, well, where's the incentive? Through to your experience of, I want to spend my money on your company. Can you contact me? And they never do. And yeah, that can be a bit frustrating.
Actually, in the end, I went off and bought an electric scooter, and no regrets, because as you say, and I live outside of Brussels, but in fact, it's only 16 kilometers from the center of Brussels. It really is such a small space. Yeah. So I get in there really, really easily, and no regrets at all. It's brilliant. Just to finalize things then, Mark, and I wish I could talk to you for much longer, but we only have a limited time.
Sure.
What kind of, is there a word of advice that you might want to give to anybody watching this about living in Brussels, or, you know, people coming to Brussels, or people who have just moved here, or even people that have been here a while? Is there a secret that you have about living in Brussels?
Yeah, very good question. I think my biggest word of advice for anybody moving to a new city or to a new country never done it before is, and this will sound, I'm going to say it, it'll sound a bit of a cliche, but it's either play a sport, have a hobby, or have a faith. And what I mean by that is there are things like sports clubs, hobby clubs, or church communities. If you were to join those, it's a really good way to meet other people where you have a common ground, whether it be a faith or a sport or a hobby. And actually, not to do too much of a plug, but for the British Chambers of Commerce, you know, commerce or a passion you have within commerce, maybe one of those, and joining there, you get to meet people where you have things in common, although they might come from completely different background, different culture, but you have something there in common. And actually that makes it more interesting compared to when you're back home, where you join your local football club or your local, hobby club, and you're meeting people where you have in common that activity, but they generally would have the same background. They might be British, they might be from Northern England or Southern England or wherever you live. So I would definitely say that. I think my family found that very helpful in terms of meeting people from different backgrounds and building a community and new friends. So the phrase is, play a sport or have a faith or something like that. But the point is of joining an institution. The other thing is, I think when you move abroad, there's always that fog of uncertainty, and there's always more fears and anxieties that come up on the cons list than on the pros list. And the reason for that is we don't know all the pros until we're actually there. So there is a bit of an element of stepping out. And I would say, from my experience, it's never the cons list is not ever as real as you think it will be. It's actually much shorter and almost non-existent. And the pros list is much longer than what you think. So step into that fog of uncertainty, and it generally be worth it. And I think when you look back in your life, that diversity and richness of experience will be super worth it. So that's the other bit of advice I would have too.
Well, on that fabulously optimistic notes and very realistic, you're absolutely right. From my experience too, it's the same thing. I'd like to thank you again for giving us your time for an afternoon tea, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you very, very soon.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you, Doug, and thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.